Silence this gun madness.
Flight to doom.
Stop the music.
He died doing his duty.
Rotten to the core.
Living proof that crime doesn't pay.
Good evening. Those are from various Daily Telegraph front pages of recent days. No longer the Telegraph Mirror, the Murdoch tabloid in Sydney is settling into a style of its own, owing more to Murdoch's London papers than, say, to its Melbourne stablemate, the unhyphenated Herald Sun. This week, my guest is the editor of the Telegraph, Allan. His background in journalism at the Sydney Mirror, the Australian, the Brisbane Sun, and reporting for News Limited from London and New York would suggest a company man. But let's see. What's the best thing you do in your newspaper?
Publish the news and raise some hell, to quote Rupert Murdoch.
One can never get Murdoch far from just behind the right shoulder of an editor of a Murdoch
Well, it's
newspaper.
interesting. I mean, my view is, and I've worked with Rupert for many years now, I think he's a fine journalist. And indeed, he understands that newspapers are only successful if they're read. You know, it's no good having the world's best newspaper if nobody reads it.
So you've got to trap the readers.
Well, I think, of course.
And you do that with your front pages.
That's part of it. Although the emphasis, I think, is increasingly on the content of the paper and the writing and the stimulation that's within the newspaper.
But they don't know that when they buy it. They know the front page when they buy the paper.
Well, that's certainly that's part of what we do, but you know, we can get somebody to buy a paper one day because of a front page. We'd like to build that loyalty. We'd like them coming back to our newspaper because they enjoyed a whole lot more than the front page.
But I want to talk a little bit about front pages. It seems to me that in your leadership of this paper, we've come to a concentration on single-issue front pages, haven't we? Has that been a conscious thing of yours?
Well, yes, I suppose it has. I think that we want to identify an issue every day or a story every day and attack it, basically.
And you do it often taking an editorial position in the headline, not necessarily in the copy on the front page, but some examples. When the pederast story was running hard in the Royal Commission in Sydney, and there was a man called Dolly Dunn, hello Dolly, and then when Philip Bell was found by your person, you had charge him. Now they're heavy editorial, well, charge him is a heavy editorial, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I'd take the view that most people in New South Wales, and indeed most of our readers, would agree with that position. I mean, the reality is that this fellow should be brought back to this country and indeed should answer the allegations against him.
Oh, look, I think it's, when you say most people will agree, you've really there articulated what tabloid journalism's about. You're not going to do a front page, are you, with which people disagree? You're not going to do a front page that says gun control is wrong. You're going to do the front page you did do for their sake. Very emotional, about the dead, they are the victims. We've decided we're against.
Of course, I mean, we take the view that we represent many of those people. I mean, we're read by 1.3 million people a day, and I mean, I'd like to think that we represent those people.
By leading or following?
Well, we must lead, of course. I mean, increasingly, the sort of work that we do is about leading rather than following. It's not always easy, but it's what we attempt to do.
But would you, for example, attempt to lead public opinion by saying, legalise marijuana?
If we thought it was right.
But what if you thought your readership wouldn't wear it?
Then we wouldn't do it.
Yeah, so you're not leading at all, you're following.
Well, I think, well, I suppose in that sense that's correct. But understanding what our readership wants is important. In that context, I'd accept that argument.
All right. What's the difference, Colin, between popular journalism, which is what you're talking about, and populism, which after all is not such a noble commodity?
Well, it comes back to this question that you asked earlier about leadership. You know, I think that we do offer leadership and that we are prepared to tackle some difficult issues. And we've done so. I mean, it was this newspaper that led the argument for increased funding for breast cancer. And we drove that for 6 months. Nobody listened to us. Nobody cared. And at the end of it, after it was realised that it was an important issue, and after it was picked up elsewhere in the media, the government offered several $100 million funding to the problem.
You can make a difference, sure. A paper like yours will make a difference in those areas, but you can't be ignorant of the fact that here in New South Wales, your editorials and front pages run Bob Carr.
Well, I'd disagree with that, and I think that Bob would probably disagree with that.
Of course, he'd disagree with it. But there's a lot of knee-jerk politics goes on derived from your front pages, isn't there?
Well, I think that's true, but I don't think it's unique to this government. I mean, I think that's been going on for quite some time. I think the government respects the authority that we have in the community.
Or the muscle.
Yes, or the muscle, whichever.
And no doubt that's just where a tabloid editor wants to be. He wants to be able to influence government policy. Do you agree?
Yes.
And that's a hell of a responsibility. I mean, you've got to be right. When you can push governments around, you've got to be right in the direction you're pushing them, haven't you?
Well, of course, and we give it great consideration. The issues that we believe in, we take a position after a great deal of discussion and weighing our options.
But that's not what I think a democracy is about. Don't you agree?
Well, the democratic power of the newspaper is derived from its audience. I mean, if we don't serve those people, we don't have an audience.
Yeah, but that means if you don't pick their prejudices right, you don't have an audience. That's just as valid an aphorism, isn't it? You've got to pick their prejudices.
Well, you use the word prejudices. It's not a word that I would use. I mean, if people want roads improved, if for example, the New South Wales government backed down on a promise to cut the tolls in Western Sydney. Now, we attacked the Carr government over that. I don't think that that's prejudicial.
No, but that's a straight hip pocket. Let's talk about some more controversial issues, like, for instance, lesbians being able to have children and have their marriages recognised. You're not going to go to bat for them, are you?
No.
Because that's not your readership's view.
Well, I mean, you know, we represent the majority of people in terms of the sort of people that they are. I mean, we represent essentially traditional families. And I'm proud to say that. And, you know, there are some changes in our society that need to be resisted.
You personally believe that?
Well, I think that it's what the newspaper represents. It's not a question of just me. I mean, the newspaper has a history. It has been consistently doing things for many years, long before I came along. And, you know, the newspaper must have a position. It must represent its audience.
But would you ever go to bat for something you knew or believed in your heart to be right, but unpopular?
Of course.
Like? Have you ever done it?
Well, you're asking me a personal question.
Yeah, you're the editor.
Yes, indeed. Well, I can't say that there, you know, is an issue that we have argued for that probably wasn't supported by the majority of people.
It's hard to think of one you would be prepared to go to bat for, knowing that your readership would say, I don't agree with this.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would know when it crossed my desk.
Well, there are issues about sexual freedom, about drug use in the community, about those sorts of human rights. The Telegraph was never a crusader against police corruption, was it?
No. Indeed, I think that the Telegraph was against, in the first instance, the setting up of the Police Royal Commission. And we said so. We felt that it was a waste of money. We were wrong.
Because it's good copy or it's good social policy?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, do you say you were wrong because it's proved to be sensational news or because it's going to change the face of the police in this?
Both.
Your paper went to considerable lengths in the case of the criminal, the ex-criminal Fred Manny, and tracked him down to a place he was living, having been released on parole. You can justify that?
Do you think the people of Bathurst were interested in knowing that they had this person living in their community.
Obviously they were.
Of course.
Do you think he had any rights to privacy? Do you think his wife and child had any right to privacy?
Well, I mean, I think that they're different issues. I understand the argument.
It's a dilemma for you.
Well, it is a dilemma, yes. I accept that. And I think that the Manny story, again, was prominent because it occurred in the last week of an election campaign where law and order was a critical issue and where indeed his release had become an important debate in political context. So I think his release and subsequent relocation were important.
It's like Philip Bell, isn't it? The alleged pederast. It's terribly important for a tabloid to actually produce the body, isn't it?
Do you mean to find him?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it is. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a pretty good piece of journalism.
Finding him?
Yes.
Now, you talked about the editorial position and so on. The editorials and the cartoons are that's one area you really do see a difference between the Broadsheet Herald and the Telegraph. There is no irony in this newspaper, is there? It's very literalist.
Yes.
That's because of your view of your readership?
Well, put it this way, we're not intellectual snobs here.
Well, irony's not the exclusive province of the ABC, is it?
Well, I think that we had something to say, and we set about saying it. And, you know, we don't try and do it with mirrors. We let people know what we think. And we do it pretty articulately, I think. But it comes back to the notion, creativity that I spoke of, and that newspapers cannot and must not be things that simply absorb news stories each day. They must have some soul, they must have some character. And, you know, Rupert Murdoch has always encouraged me to think that way.
Well, thanks for talking to us, Carl.
Pleasure.
Next week, back to normal. Good night to you.